Story 1. For students in my high school murdered a 13-year-old boy who caught them stealing a minibike. When I heard about it, I had no doubt they were guilty. None of them denied it, and they were all convicted. I also wanted to add that the minibike had no engine and had an estimated value of $5. Story 2. We used to meet for a week every spring with two couples. One couple were old college friends, and the other were their coworkers. We really liked them and their two young children. We got together for several years. Then we received the call that the wife had been killed with a hammer in their basement. The scene was expertly cleaned, and the police were focusing on the husband, who happened to be a nurse. He ended up injecting himself with something to dull the pain and then stabbed himself in the heart. We never suspected he was capable of something like this, and we don't know why he did it. I hope the children turned out okay. Story 3. I was a server at a diner, and one of the regulars, Johnny, was a quiet and aloof guy. He was a little slow but well-mannered and kind. He knew the menu well and what he liked. One day, he casually mentioned that his dad was the original owner of the diner and that he himself used to work there. After he left, another regular told me he was shocked that Johnny brought up his dad, considering he had stabbed his dad to death during a drug and alcohol-induced psychosis. I was floored. It ended up being a very well-known case when it happened. He had gotten out of jail and was under heavy psychological supervision, understandably. Story 4. I was shocked. This was a woman I had let hold my child, was best friends with my sister-in-law, came to all the family parties, and we always had a good time when I saw her. She was the caretaker for her mother with Alzheimer's, and I think she must have had some sort of mental health issue for a while because she smothered her mother and faced charges for elder abuse and violent crimes. She was found wandering the streets, asking strangers to please kill her. When the police were called, they went back to her home and discovered that her mother had been dead for about a week. She had been texting and calling friends, talking about sports and so on, as if nothing was wrong while living in the house with her deceased mother in the other room until the day she went out and asked people to kill her. I later found out she had also randomly attacked a friend while they were hanging out a few months before she murdered her mother. Just laughing and having drinks, and the next thing the friend knew, the woman was on top of her trying to strangle her. Story 5. I looked up a friend from college to see where he ended up and found an obituary and a news story. It turned out his younger brother killed him during an argument just a couple of months earlier. He seemed like a nice person when I met him. Story 6. I had a coworker who went from being a really smart and cultured person to having wild ideas about catching sexually transmitted diseases from working with colleagues. He started getting aggressive with certain people. One day he came in and began taking pictures of the individuals he had been aggressive with, the last one being me. I told my supervisor I wouldn't continue working there if he was, as he made me feel threatened, and I was sure those pictures were for some kind of kill list. She let him go, and after speaking with her boss, we decided to close the store because he seemed like the kind of person who would come back and do something. I never saw him again but looked him up occasionally because I just knew he would end up in the news one day. About 5 years later, he shot up a hospital. Among the evidence found in his home were lists and photos of the people he wanted to kill. It turned out he had schizophrenia and went off his medication a few months after we started working together. Story 7. My ex-fiancé was violent with me on the night of our engagement party, and I honestly thought he was going to kill me. No one believed me when I told them. No one believed he'd be capable of hurting me in that way. I had been abused in other ways before, emotionally and verbally, and he'd slapped or pushed me from time to time, but that was the first and only significantly violent incident where I was being properly beaten. His eyes were different that night, as if there was nothing behind them at all. 8 years later, exactly 8 years to the day, after marrying the woman he cheated on me with and having a baby together, he murdered them both and is now locked away pending trial. He stabbed them to death, flew to another city, and lived it up in a hotel for 2 days before turning himself in. He left the bodies in the house, which were only discovered after he was in custody. I can't imagine the scene, and the whole event really shook our town and community. I thought it was all a dream until his face was all over the news, and my phone began to blow up. I found out the day he turned himself in, and as it happened, I had just arrived for a brief holiday in the same city where he had turned himself in. It gives me chills. It ended up being incredible timing as I was able to give my statement directly to the detective who interviewed my ex and ask any questions I needed for closure. I received so many messages and calls apologizing for not believing me back then, many expressing gratitude that I got away from him, as that could have been me. My mother called me, crying and thankful that she still has me. It was strange. I felt so numb. I'm glad people are finally acknowledging my trauma now, after all these years. It's helping with closure and healing. But it was hard going through that season of the breakup, feeling very alone and being treated like I was the crazy ex for voicing what had happened to me in that relationship. Story 8. A local individual with a history of violence was involved in the death of an elderly man during a bar altercation recently. For some reason, he is not in prison. Story 9. I know a woman, my friend's ex-wife, who accidentally killed a cyclist while driving. I don't believe her story at all. She claims she sneezed and hit him, but they were in a residential area where the speed limit was 15 miles per hour near a school, and the extent of his injuries does not align with what she says happened. She exhibits erratic behavior. She is prone to emotional outbursts, tantrums, and speeding when angry, just extremely unstable. After this man died, she posted all over social media about how she was so traumatized and how she considers herself a survivor of trauma. She wants to be an example of a strong woman to her children. She never mentioned that she killed someone, nor did she express remorse, sadness, or condolences for his family. When confronted, she simply cries and plays the victim, blaming him for coming out of nowhere. We suspect she was arguing on the phone and speeding home. Story 10. A former roommate hit and killed a man on a bike while driving under the influence. He drove home from the bar intoxicated every day. I had been warning for years that he would eventually harm someone, and then it finally happened. He served 6 months in jail. Story 11. I know someone who went to prison for attempted murder after beating his girlfriend's husband nearly to death. I don't know if I would suspect him. He was somewhat foolish back in the day and a little unstable but not violent. I was surprised when I found out. Story 12. A guy I used to go to school with, who was occasionally a drinking partner, killed a soldier in the pub where we had been drinking. Apparently, the soldier had inappropriately touched Paul's girlfriend, and Paul politely asked him to stop. They were pulled apart and thrown out. Outside, the confrontation continued, and the soldier pulled a knife. Paul took it from him and then stabbed him 8 times. He was picked up in Dover the next morning. I knew he was hot-headed, but that was shocking. He was sentenced to involuntary manslaughter and received an 8-year sentence, but was released after 3 years. Story 13. I met a rapper named Viper who kidnapped a girl and had her locked in his garage for an unknown duration. He is strange and unsettling and is currently facing a life sentence in prison, which is where he belongs. Story 14. I never considered it a possibility. We worked together and he lived a few blocks away. He and his wife had an infant and he had a daughter from a previous relationship. His wife worked the second shift for emergency services. Sometimes he would call me for help or just to have someone around. We were about 22 years old. I am 43 now. I didn't hear from him for a couple of months, and we were no longer working together. One day, he called to tell me his infant had passed away from sudden infant death syndrome. It was maybe a month or 2 later. He was oddly calm, and it felt strange to me. He started fundraising for SIDS awareness, which became his whole personality, a transition that seemed understandable at the time. One day, while Christmas shopping, my phone wasn't working properly. I had many missed calls from him, but I didn't feel like calling him back. He called again later that night and left a voicemail. I didn't listen to it. The next day, the news was on in the background. As they described a horrific event, I thought, that sounds like Steve. I turned around as they displayed his mugshot. I finally listened to my voicemail. He asked me to call him and mentioned something bad had happened to his daughter. He had beaten and strangled his 4-year-old to keep her from her mother. He confessed to suffocating the baby as well. Over the last 20 years, I have considered writing to him often to ask why he kept calling, but I never have. He seemed like a sweet guy. I never felt unsafe around him. I was in his home alone with him many times and never felt uneasy. It seemed like he loved his children. Story 15. My stalker killed the next person he targeted. Yes, I suspected it. However, everyone, including my mother, told me I should be flattered. Story 16. I know a man who killed someone. He was in Las Vegas, won a few $1,000s, and was walking back to his hotel with his winnings when he was attacked by two men. He was stabbed in the leg, took the attacker's knife and stabbed him, resulting in his death. He was not charged and stayed in the police station overnight, answering questions. When he told me, I wasn't surprised. It aligned with the general craziness that surrounds him. Story 17. I know at least 3 people who have killed someone. I suspect another one, but that is just because I find him creepy. One person killed a man in a knife fight at a bar. He is out now. I met him afterward, and I think he is really nice, very funny, and would kill you for your cheeseburger. One guy I grew up with was always kind of crazy, so it didn't surprise me at all. He got into a shootout with the police. Another guy was a really good friend who got deeply involved in meth, robbed, and killed his dealer. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Story 18. My former flatmate killed a woman he was stalking. He hadn't been my flatmate for at least 5 years at that point, and I was absolutely shocked. He was the typical quiet and shy type. When I knew him, he had a girlfriend, worked in information technology, and played both board and video games. He seemed like a normal guy. I was shocked when I saw his picture in the news. He pleaded guilty, so I guess that's something. Please note, this incident occurred in New Zealand, not the United States, for added context. Story 19. Both individuals I met had committed murder long before our acquaintance. One was involved in a gang during his youth and participated in some violence but eventually escaped that life. The other was carrying a firearm when she was mugged by a man who had been loitering in the area for a few days, and she shot him. Both were quite open about what transpired. Story 20. I worked with a woman and her adult daughter for about 6 months before I discovered they had both gone to prison for collaborating to murder their husband and father. I wasn't very surprised because it was clear they had both experienced difficult lives, but they were also both quite petite and friendly, which made it surprising they were capable of such actions. Story 21. I was absolutely stunned to learn that my older brother's friend from high school, who was the nicest and friendliest houseguest, ended up murdering his 2 children years later. He was like a second older brother to us younger kids and lived with us for a while when there was a family issue on his side. Story 22. I didn't know him, but my great-grandfather went to prison for attempted murder. I found out about it while doing genealogical research and saw newspaper articles about it. Apparently, when he was very young, he became involved with a much older married woman who convinced him that her husband was horribly abusing her and that she was in fear for her life, asking for his help. She made homemade candy for her husband laced with arsenic, which my great-grandfather had purchased for her at her request. She was caught after her husband survived the poisoning, and then she set up my great-grandfather by asking him to buy more arsenic. He was arrested when he arrived with it at her home. The news story mentioned that she had written a note to accompany the candy she made for her husband. I can't remember exactly what she wrote, but it was pretty eerie considering the candy was poisoned. Something like, "I can't wait for you to try this candy. It's to die for." It struck me that she was a bad, possibly sociopathic person who had likely misled my young, naive, love-struck great-grandfather into thinking he was saving her from a desperate situation. She somehow escaped punishment while my great-grandfather went to prison for 8 years. My father, who is a very religious and incredibly wonderful and inspiringly moral person, loved my great-grandfather deeply. When I discovered the story and asked my dad if he knew, he said he did but found out about it later in life. This knowledge did not change his opinion of the man, who he continued to believe was a very good person. He always described my great-grandfather as a loving and gentle person, someone who was particularly kind. Had I been a boy, I would have had his first name. Story 23. Growing up towards the end of elementary school, I would stay the night with a friend. His parents were often fighting, and numerous times his father threatened to kill his mother. His mother dared him to do it each time, While it was still shocking, it wasn't a surprise when he actually did it. I was in high school when his father murdered his mother, then went to the police station and confessed. Later, my friend, who I hadn't spoken to in a long time, committed suicide. I don't know how his siblings are doing. By chance, I ran into his brother at one point while out. While he seemed self-destructive with drugs and alcohol, I don't think he was suicidal. All that trauma, it is no small wonder he sought to numb himself. Story 24. I've known two individuals. One was a boy a few years younger than me. He was the younger brother of a girl I attended middle school with, and I knew him casually. We had a few mutual friends and hung out in a group a few times as teenagers. I remember him as a bit of a wise guy. I was definitely surprised 10 years later when I learned he had killed his stepfather. I believe it may have been an abuse or self-defense situation, but I don't remember for sure. I had no idea he was living that kind of life at home, but I didn't know him well enough to learn more. The other was a man I worked with as a teenager and into my 20s. I worked as a loader and unloader in a shipping warehouse where my father was a driver. One of the other loaders was an older man who I later learned had served 10 years in prison for the death of a police officer when he was younger. I never got the full story but always wondered why he was no longer in prison. Perhaps he was only tangentially involved. I heard stories about his temper, but I mostly got along with him. We weren't friends, but I exchanged jokes and stories with him just as I did with the other guys. I've known several other people who I could imagine taking a life more easily than those two individuals. Story 25. 3 of them. Steve Mignogna rode my school bus and was in my scout troop. We had overlapping delivery routes for different newspapers. In 1988, he picked up 2 girls, ages 12 and 13, at a video game arcade, took them home, raped one, then slit their throats. He was described as a quiet guy and always polite, but he had a dark streak. We were all shocked when we heard about it, but it wouldn't have been that far out of character for him. A podcast did an episode on him, dedicated to my friend Steph, who was close friends with the victims. I didn't know Steph until many years later. Jillian Robbins, the Penn State shooter. On September 17, 1996, she took a Mauser rifle to the lawn of the Hetzel Union building, hid in the bushes, and fired 5 shots. She killed 1 student, badly wounded a second, and struck possibly 2 other students without injuring them. A passerby saw her attempting to reload, tackled her, and disarmed her. I worked with Jillian at a convenience store in town. She was very smart, a talented artist, an award-winning marksman, and deeply mentally ill. Around the time of the shooting, I hadn't seen her in several months since neither of us worked at the store anymore, but she was working with a friend at a diner. Within a few weeks, she was fired, lost her boyfriend and shared apartment, was dismissed from the army because she didn't graduate from high school, and went off her medication. She snapped. I was in town and heard what was almost certainly the gunshots, several muted cracks like someone dropping planks of wood on a hard surface. I found out what had happened a few hours later when my friend who had worked with her called me. She was planning on shooting herself and didn't know why she fired at other people instead. We wouldn't have been surprised if she had taken her own life, but what she did was very unexpected. She'll spend the rest of her life in a mental hospital, where she belongs. Michael was my best friend from ages 3 to 14. He lived across the street, and although we went to different schools, we were together every day. Our moms worked together, and we even went camping often. Around age 14, he started drifting away. I was involved with school and Boy Scouts, and he started hanging around with other guys, including Steve Mignogna. He got into drugs. I saw him less and less, and then he became just a stranger on the street. Our life paths diverged. He got into trouble multiple times. His sister moved from Pennsylvania to Washington, so his parents moved out there with him, hoping to get him away from the bad scene, but it didn't work. In 2004, he drove back to our hometown in Pennsylvania to confront someone over a drug deal. After a fight, he broke into the guy's house and stabbed him to death. My dad was an emergency medical technician and volunteered with the ambulance service. He held the guy as he died. At that point, I hadn't seen Michael in 10 years, so I didn't know what to think. He was a stranger by then. He was caught in Washington, brought back to Pennsylvania, and went to prison. He was released just a few years ago. I don't know what happened to him after that. It's strange to think about how this little town of 2,500 residents ended up having two guys who grew up on the same street and were even friends, who went on to commit murders 16 years apart. Story 26. Two of my friends killed a third friend of mine. I still can't wrap my head around it all these years later. You might have read about this, it was significant news. My friends were Ron Baker, Duncan Martinez, and Nathan Blaylock. I've typed this out multiple times, and it's hard to know what to say. But I will say this. The most shocking thing is that Duncan and Nathan sat with all of us, worried about Ron when he was just missing, and cried and mourned when he was found dead. It was the worst betrayal. You feel ashamed that you knew them and that you should have somehow known. It's irrational, I know, and another of our group of friends and I have talked about this endlessly over the years. How could we have been friends with someone who could do something like that? Story 27. I knew someone growing up who had various untreated mental health issues. I wasn't surprised when I found out. I did wonder if he would have received the help he needed while growing up if things had ended differently. Story 28. An acquaintance of mine took his own life, along with his mother-in-law and young daughter, before setting his house on fire. I didn't know him well as he graduated with my older sister, but my family had known his for a while, so it was a shock to us all. Even today, there is no concrete answer as to why he did it, sadly. Story 29. My mother's boyfriend at the time was my younger sister's dad. I may have been too young to remember or realize his behavior, but I remember looking up to him as a second father until he murdered my mother. I was 6 when it happened, but I have mostly good memories of him until that point. Story 30. My husband's aunt got remarried to a man who came into our home and took a seat on the stairs. I was on the couch and his face and body language felt off. I felt very uneasy every time I was alone with him. My mother-in-law visited them in their town, which was hours away, and this man kept telling my husband's aunt that my mother-in-law was a bad influence. He questioned what the church would think if they saw them at the bar together. However, it turned out that that bar might have possibly saved my mother-in-law's life. My husband's aunt ended up getting very drunk while they were hanging out at the bar, and she let it slip that he was a convicted felon. His crime? He had strangled his girlfriend to death. He served only 10 years before being released. As soon as my mother-in-law found that out, she quickly left, not even telling them she was leaving that night. My husband and I were wondering why she came home so early from her trip until she told us what happened. On the bright side, he ended up dying some years later. Additionally, my husband's aunt is not blood-related. It was more of a "you're like family to me now" situation. Story 31. A man a few doors down from me killed 3 people. I honestly would never have suspected it if he hadn't volunteered the information, partially because he is elderly, nearing 90, but also because he is incredibly kind. Story 32. I just posted this, feel like I've experienced it before. I knew the family of the Golden State Killer. No one ever suspected a thing. If you want the details, look it up. It's a lot. Story 33. He gave off unsettling vibes, but not violent ones. He worked as a printing technician at a copy center, so I should have realized. Unfortunately, he killed his wife with a bat and was caught due to blood spatter evidence. Story 34. I didn't suspect he'd kill someone, but I quickly realized he was dangerous. He was extremely handsome, which always raises my guard. Then he proved to be unpleasant, and I stopped associating with him. He had a best friend named Michael, whom I really liked, and I invited him to my New Year's Eve party in 2009-10. Michael was the life of the party, just a genuinely good person. I didn't understand their friendship. 2 months later, Michael's friend shot and killed him. It was truly sad and messed up. The murderer has already served his time and is now out. I'm not sure what exactly happened, nor did I want to know. Rest in peace, Michael. Story 35. I would have never predicted it. A very talented and kind person I knew in college had a psychotic break and murdered his mother, grandparents, and the grandparents' caregiver. Then he walked next door, naked and covered in blood, and told the neighbors, "I freed them." I edited this because I looked up the news story and realized I had misquoted what he said. Story 36. I had a friend who committed murder-suicide with his wife. He grew up in a broken and abusive household and displayed possessive behavior throughout their relationship, so it should not have been such a shock. This was particularly concerning given his tendencies toward gun fetishization. Story 37. About 10 years ago, a man was brutally murdered for informing the police. He was tied and gagged and taken to a remote location where he was attacked. It was a small town, so such events were unusual. The rumor was that the police knew who was responsible but lacked the evidence to prove it. Fast forward to about 2 years ago, my brother, my niece, and I were eating dinner when he revealed the identity of the murderer. A kid my age who sat beside me in every single class I attended during 10th grade at the time of the murder. Story 38. 40 years ago, my stepdad killed a likely homeless person because he caught the man in the act of assaulting my mother. He struck the man's head with a rock and buried him. It was at a state park, and the incident never made the news. The crazy thing is that my sister and I were there that day and didn't know anything had happened. Story 39. My biological father beat a man to death because he asked for some money. I have a news clipping with a photo of him from the front page of the Los Angeles Times. Shirtless, covered in blood. He was arrested by 2 police officers shortly afterward. It happened the day after I was born. He was walking around Glendale looking for a job in the middle of the day when a drunk panhandler started demanding money from him. I guess my father flipped out and went berserk on the man. Nothing significant happened. He spent a night in jail and they let him go. It turned out the man he killed was already dead. He had faked his own death years earlier and was known as a local nuisance to the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. No one would talk about it. My sister and I suspect that the district attorney and the sheriff figured he had done them a favor, so they called it self-defense and let it go. He was always good at sweet-talking his way out of trouble. That is the only homicide my sister and I have been able to confirm. However, he has bragged about others to us, but we think he was lying because that is what he does. He was telling me a story about how he had to murder his cellmate during his time in San Quentin because the warden refused to put him in his own cell. When I pressed him for details, I could tell he was making things up. I suspect what really happened was that he got into a fight with his cellmate but decided to exaggerate it, thinking that we would be impressed or scared. There are other stories of his violent escapades that my sister found in old news clippings or police reports around Southern California. We do know he was capable of violence. I remember him as a child during his occasional visitation rights to see me between stints in prison. Things could turn chaotic very quickly when he was around. I never looked forward to his visits. Amazingly, they could be worse than where we were being housed at the time, mostly because they were always nothing but out-of-control chaos. Now, switching gears. I didn't know this killer, but I thought I would share this. A friend of mine, a former coworker, is from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She worked with serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. She told me he was creepy. She is a bit younger than he was during his killing spree. Yikes. I get sick to my stomach even thinking about him. Story 40. I remember telling a guidance counselor that I was afraid he was going to hurt someone or worse. About 4 years later, he sexually assaulted and then killed a girl in the woods. It was shocking, but it didn't surprise me at all. Story 41. In my senior year of high school, one of my closest friends hinted that he was about to take a vacation. Tragically, he ended his life shortly after taking the life of his girlfriend. Story 42. Someone I was friends with in high school was murdered a couple of years after graduation. He was considered a missing person for some time, until the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, using an undercover operation, discovered he was murdered by 3 other guys our age. One of them I went to elementary school with, and one I was also friends with in high school. The third I knew by association, but we were never friends. Both of the ones I knew were definitely a little different. However, I don't think most of our community saw it coming. To top it all off, all of the boys were friends growing up and stayed involved with his family while they were searching for their missing son. It was horrific. Story 43. He was in my Army Reserve unit. He would do anything for anybody, was soft-spoken, and never said an unkind word to anyone. He almost completely decapitated his wife with a K-bar knife. He confessed immediately, When asked why in court, he said, "I was sick of her." He said it in a matter-of-fact way without emotion. Story 44. I had an online friend group for a couple of years, and someone invited a friend of theirs into the group chat. He was a shy kid and seemed much younger than the rest of us in our late 20s. Someone I was closer to in the group mentioned that he was lonely and probably dealing with some heavy issues. He could use a friend or maybe an older male role model. All I knew about this guy's interests was that he liked anime, so I reached out to him and we made small talk about it. He recommended Food Wars. I watched some of it that night before going to bed quite late. The following day, I woke up to texts around noon from my friend, who told me to check the news. There was a mass shooting in Ohio, which was sad and gut-wrenching. Then I saw who the shooter was. It was that lonely anime guy. The Dayton, Ohio shooter, Connor Betts, had recommended Food Wars to me casually, telling me to let him know what I thought about it. The next day, he went on a shooting spree. I never suspected that I was trading anime recommendations with a future mass shooter. He died in a shootout with the police, and the whole situation was incredibly surreal. Story 45. My previous answer about going to high school with Jimmy Holmes, the Aurora Theater shooter. To answer your question, no, I never suspected he would be capable of anything like that. To me, he was just Jimmy, yet another aloof, nerdy guy in our friend group. Story 46. When I was in 4th grade, there was a boy who kept trying to be my friend. However, he made me nervous, and I tried to avoid him because something about him felt off. He was always complimenting me, not in the way that friends might, but more like someone with an unhealthy obsession with a celebrity. I was not popular in 4th grade. I was a shy, awkward nerd who preferred to be alone. Additionally, if I became interested in something, he would copy me and suddenly get interested in the same thing. He was very creepy. After 4th grade, I switched to another school for unrelated reasons and never heard from him again. That is, until high school, when there was a shocking local news story about a student who shot and killed both his parents and his older brother. I guess I could tell there was something wrong with him, but I didn't suspect he would kill his family. Story 47. A relative, now deceased, was accused of multiple brutal murders. It was definitely him. Even as children, we knew to be very cautious around him due to his short temper and other undiagnosed issues. He was heavily involved with a local gang. He confessed on his deathbed, and they still do not know the location of one of the bodies. He was a terrible person, and I am glad he is no longer alive. Story 48. Yes, even as kids, he had no self-worth. His escalating crimes led to the killing of a woman during his probation. We were similar in many ways. He was part of the neighborhood group, and I hated him. I still do. Story 49. I've known 2 people who killed someone. One was a shock, the other not so much. The first person I knew was a guy I went to school with. He was a senior when I was a freshman and was on the football team with me. It was a small town, so everybody knew each other and were all pretty close. Even though he was a few grades ahead, we still knew each other quite well. This guy had been held back a year or 2 and had already done a short stint in county jail for assault. He was nice most of the time, but he also had a really short temper and would explode at the slightest offense, often resorting to physical violence. I watched him get arrested at football practice for violating his probation. When he didn't like that, he got tackled and started throwing punches, ending up splitting one of our teammates' lips in half with his class ring. A year or 2 after he graduated high school, I found out from a friend that he had been in and out of trouble for breaking into houses and businesses, but he finally hit the end of the road when he got into a scuffle with someone on the beach. They fought, and then he went to his car, retrieved a baseball bat, and beat the guy to death with it. The craziest part of this story? He only served about 10 years, and he has been a free man for about a decade now. Now, this one is the shocking case. This kid was several years younger than me. He was the son of one of my dad's tenants and lived next door to us. He was a very sweet-natured kid when I knew him. His dad worked at one of the local plants, and his mom was a homemaker. The kid used to come over and watch my dad and me work on my Mustang that we were restoring. He was probably about 8 years old at the time. He was a good kid. He'd ask questions, be very respectful, and thought the car, and by extension, we were the coolest. His mom was a little unstable. So I wasn't surprised to learn that his parents divorced shortly after I graduated high school and went their separate ways. I didn't hear anything about that family for a handful of years after that. While I was on a local community forum, I saw a news report posted about the kid. Apparently, he was 15 years old and staying with his mom, who had taken a job as a live-in caretaker for a nonagenarian on hospice care. He wanted to visit his girlfriend, but his mom refused to take him, leading to an argument. He was unhappy about this. He waited until his mom fell asleep, retrieved a hammer, and attacked her. He then stole a bunch of pills, took the old man's car, and drove about an hour away to his girlfriend's house, where he spent the evening taking pills and having sex with her. He ended up overdosing on the pills and was taken to the hospital in a coma. When he regained consciousness, the police were waiting for him because they had found his mom, and he confessed. I believe he received a 50-year sentence. He will be gone for a long time. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.